Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Leadership Exchange podcast with me, your host, Christopher Pietroni. This podcast is brought to you by the University of Birmingham, where I'm Professor of Leadership Practice and Director of the Birmingham Leadership Institute. In this podcast, we ask whether the kinds of challenges that we're facing have the right kinds of leadership or whether we need to exchange them for something new. I'm absolutely delighted today that I'm joined by Andy Street, the West Midlands Metro Mayor, and also a Brummie born and bred, so we're even happier to have him on this podcast. Andy was first elected as the Metro Mayor in 2017, again in 2021, but before that was already very well known and prominent as the enormously successful managing director of John Lewis. John Lewis's sales 50% up, no doubt just one reason why he was named by management today as one of the most successful leaders in business. Andy, thank you for being with us.
Well, Christopher, it's lovely to be here and to take part in your wonderful institute.
Thank you. So, Andy, I thought we might start. Well, actually, when you ran last as a mayor, I don't know if you remember this, but you said that not only did you wish to be judged on your record, but also how I've demonstrated my values.
Yes.
And I thought we might begin there and,
Yes.
and to explore, what those values are and what you think the significance of them are for your leadership.
Very willing to, and just let me explain why I said that back in 2021. And you'd probably say politicians say all sorts of things on the campaign trail. But the reason I said it is that this role as elected mayor for the whole of the West Midlands, 3 million people, it is a representative role. It's not a whipped role within a party. It's about, overused word, one I suspect we'll use a lot in the next 40 minutes or so. It's about being a leader for people. And I wanted people sitting at home watching me on the telly or whatever thinking, yeah, I can relate to that guy. I'm happy that he's the one who's representing me in London or in New York on a business trip or something, or with another community in India, as I was just last year. People need to feel, his value set reflects mine, is appropriate. And what do I think those values are? There's a big piece for me about inclusivity, being able to genuinely spread across this very, very diverse community. I can't hope possibly to understand every community like members of them do, but I hope people say, at least he's made an effort, at least he understands the importance of this. I hope there's something as well about modesty, about honesty, integrity. And so even if people don't agree with me, they'll say he's absolutely straightforward, he's honest, he says it as it is, and I believe that he will do his very best for us.
Where do you think when were those values formed? I mean, do they go a long way back for you? Is this sort of, formative experiences?
Oh, I'm a huge believer that, I'm going to say two conflicting things now. Huge believer that those values go right back to your upbringing. But I'm also a believer that you never stop learning. And gosh, I've learned a lot in this job. So it's not that sort of something set in stone by the time you're 5 years old or something, but things that were sort of imprinted upon in me very early on. And if I think of that sort of notion, those notions of honesty, integrity, all of those things, which sound so banal, but so many people in politics are found not to have those things, aren't they? So it's perhaps worth reflecting. It doesn't always happen. If I think of the way in which the business I led for 10 years, what were the hallmarks of John Lewis? Hopefully they were those things. I remember when we recruited an advertising agency. John Lewis hadn't really done much advertising before I became the boss, and then we became famous for it. The brief to the advertising agency was sell the public trust, a word that is a hugely values-driven word. And the agency sort of looked at me blinking a bit, saying, well, that's not something you can advertise. I said, that's what we want to do, because I understood our USP with the public was to get to a value space that others couldn't get to. And I hope that as the guy who led that business, embodied it, was the spokesman for it, my personal behaviour would have transmitted that as well. And I hope even some people will never agree with me politically. I hope how I go about doing this job, the same thing is there.
And I mean, I think people would recognise that in John Lewis, and the institution of the John Lewis Christmas ad clearly kind of draws on that. obviously your role now is very different.
But the values can be the same.
So what is it that you do? What is the leadership activity that communicates those values in the way that you seek to lead now?
There's the point about being the front man first, because that's where a lot of the members of the public see those values coming through. And I'm sure there'll be some hearing this say, no, he doesn't do this, he's deluding himself. But what I'd say I would try to do, the obvious point is you're interviewed by journalists all the time. I always try to be incredibly straightforward in how I answer the question. People always, my team often say, you're too honest, frankly. You haven't got the politician's ability to swerve. But I hope people are sitting at home watching the telly when they see me doing that, thinking, yeah, that he tells it as it is. It is straight. And actually to step forward and admit something when you're wrong as well is also very important. Perhaps politicians don't do it. So when things go wrong, we're asked to do a media interview, it would be very easy to say, no, I don't really want to appear today. But no, you step forward. You take the rough with the smooth. And I think the sort of the ex-CEO in me, what you learn in business, I hope I've carried that forward into how I would go forward into that comms piece. But then there's other sort of sense of values, who you choose to recruit in your team, very, very important. Because in a leadership role, you're represented by your team. So the assessment of people around you is very, very important. The way, and I'm sure we'll come on to this, the way you develop those people, give them rope, all of that. But I'm very conscious that you are represented by other people, so you have to choose the right people.
Is service a word that you feel comfortable with? I mean, one of the reasons I ask that is that I think as a young man, you did a lot of work with organisations like Birmingham Youth Volunteers. I mean, is that, so it seems to have been there a long way back.
So that's why I say these things are instilled upon you. Now, this might be stretching too far, but my family's upbringing was Quakerish.
Right.
My own upbringing was fairly irreligious, actually. But but I think what I look back on in my upbringing was, although it was irreligious, the people around me, a lot of them were from that background, and I think they did instill that notion of service in me as a very young person. So actually, I am very, very happy with the concept now that I am here to serve the citizens of the West Midlands. And that is exactly as I see it. All of our efforts can only be about one thing. Is there a better outcome for them?
Lovely. Thank you. So you were mentioning a moment ago about, the team that you pick and so on.
Yeah.
And when you first became mayor,
yes,
one of the very first things you did was to set up the West Midlands Leadership Commission, which was focused on trying to look at why leadership in the region really didn't look like the region, and it was in some ways a pretty bold and rather unusual early priority to have. So why was that so important?
Well, a number of the early priorities, people say, well, strange thing to do on the first day. So the very first day, we spent our time with the person who's ended up leading a homelessness task force so effectively for 6 years. So what was the priority for the incoming elected as a Conservative mayor? Work out your structure to homelessness. Probably not what people think is the natural place to go first, but it's actually the same answer behind that as there is behind the leadership question. There was something in here which said to me, there's something not right about this. And then I said right at the beginning, this notion of justice, this notion of sort of integrity, it just wasn't right. And that's why we put two of these, to use your words, not mine, because I thought it was absolutely natural, but many people have said to me it's surprising, on two of these things forward earlier on.
You use the word justice as a motivator for addressing these questions of kind of inclusion and representation. And a lot of people will be really attracted to that. But it's also been a feature of, the last several years that some of the issues around this issue have got highly polarised, politicised even.
Yeah.
The England team taking the knee, the role that, Gareth Southgate played in kind of putting that out there. And I'm curious about how you engage with sort of both sides of that. You're deep in the one of the most prominent Conservative politicians in the country. Has it become harder?
No. It's a really interesting question, actually. But for me personally, it hasn't become harder because I sort of reject all extreme symbolism. Okay, and so I very much try to take a pragmatic line down the middle. If I think it's right and has to be done, that's it. So I personally support the taking the knee. And when people got excited about those doing it and very critical of it, I just thought, what on earth is all this about? It's a it's a relatively innocuous statement that's meant to mean something very, very deep, and I find that absolutely sensible. So my answer to it is not to be sucked in to the extreme versions of this, to have a sort of pragmatic, moderate, tolerant, inclusive approach to it. I always said on that first election, this was going to be about a moderate, tolerant, inclusive form of conservatism, and I've not wavered in that in my own mind. And I think having that, one of the things I've learned in this job, you have to be confident of your own mind and your own judgments and not be buffeted really by all these things going on. And what's your question is really about is don't allow yourself to be buffeted, and I don't.
The pressure must come though.
Of course, but in a job like this, where, as I said right at the beginning, 3 million people judging whether I'm an appropriate leader, ultimately, the thing that you have to be clear about is whether you've done the right thing by your own standards. And sometimes I know I've probably done something that's not politically expedient, but you look yourself in the mirror and say, have you done the right thing? That's okay.
And going back to the commission and its purpose, I mean, what progress do you think has been made?
Well, I don't think we've made enough progress. I'm going to be very straight with you there. I really don't. The work was brilliant work, absolutely shone a light on it, and there's lots of individual examples of brilliant outcomes as a result of it. One thing I'm so proud of in it, actually, and it talks to the sort of long burn, and you've got to be consistent. We identified we needed to bring more young, diverse people into different forms of leadership. So we set up our own young combined authority, something we could do deliberately ourselves, didn't need to influence any other organisation. And we had a whole group of people came forward to represent the region, reflecting the gender balance, the ethnic balance, the LGBT balance, the sort of disability balance. And I was really pleased with what we did. If I look around the total leadership, political leadership of the region, have we made the difference? I would hope the answer is no. But do I think that every private sector organisation in the West Midlands is now absolutely alert to it? And indeed, some public sector organisations have made vast progress. Health Service particularly good, some of the other public sector organisations less good. But do we keep battling on? Have we got onto the agenda? Have we got clear examples of cut through? Yes.
And I was curious about your foregrounding the young combined authority, combined authority, because in your obvious pride in the fact that there were young people who were growing in confidence and leaning into their own leadership, and that seems to be something also I've picked up is important to you, that sense of how you bring people on, how you develop people, and I was just curious to hear a little bit about your own experiences of your leadership development. I mean, the John Lewis Graduate Development Programme is sort of famous and famous for making you go right to the front line. And of course, you ended up at the top of the shop. But was that
so?
Important?
My first leadership development of real value was nothing to do with John Lewis. It was before John Lewis. And you mentioned earlier on, I didn't pick it up, but it was actually in a charitable organisation I was part of here. And we used to run holiday camps for children from the city who perhaps wouldn't have got a break otherwise. And I was very young. I think it was less than 20, and I was in charge of one of these things, a group of 60 people for a week. And I look back at what have been the defining moments on my trip. I know being responsible for those people for a week, and what a challenge it was to me as a young learner. I learnt more and developed more through that than any other single thing I've done in my life. So the sort of message is, put yourself into an uncomfortable leadership position as early as you can, because you are likely to rise to it. And I look back and I feel very lucky to have been given the chance to do that. So that was the single biggest formative experience for me.
And what was it about that? I mean, was it the responsibility, the trust, needing to
It was the sense of responsibility.
Others? Was it?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to exaggerate and overplay it, but some of the youngsters were quite challenging, and it wasn't necessarily going to be a safe, peaceful week. And I knew that the buck stopped with me, how everybody coexisted for the week, really. We got even some of the most basic safety stuff in place, and you did feel it's an overused word, it was an enormous challenge, a stretch, and I am a huge believer that people overall will respond positively to that situation.
So did you get anything from the John Lewis training?
No, at all. Of course I did. As you say, those formal graduate training schemes are very good at what they do, of course. But I think the thing from John Lewis I would pull out is the power of role models. Yes, the formal training was there, but the thing that really probably gave me the personal breakthrough was a couple of role models who were very, very different actually as characters. An interesting point there about you can learn a lot from lots of different experiences. But I was put with them to learn as a youngster coming through, and hopefully somebody recognised I might have some potential. And I was put with them, and it was very much that role model, learning from the role model. And again, I feel very lucky to have been given those opportunities. But you sense that someone was planning that for you.
Tell us a bit about them. What was it that they were role modelling that was so impactful on you?
Two different people, very, very different characters. The first person, I need to tell you a little about the situation. This guy ran our shop in Nottingham at the time. It was our most successful shop, and I was there as his assistant. I was very young, very formative, and he was an absolute sod to anyone who was not in his team in Nottingham. So I learned something. It's probably quite a bad lesson when taken to extremity, about how you draw teams together through a real sort of sense of endeavour for that team in a positive sense of competition. He was an absolute master at it because he made it by a country mile the most successful business John Lewis had. Some of his tactics probably would be a bit questionable in the light of 30 years experience, but what he taught me about how you galvanise teams in friendly competition was brilliant. The second person, very, very different character, and he told me something completely different. The importance of standards, professionalism, discipline in a team. People might think they're old-fashioned words, but I happen to think myself that they are actually really important in leadership.
It's fascinating. That first example about forming of a team, and actually that's one of the things we know about how teams form, isn't it? That unless people feel a sense of us,
camaraderie,
which of course implies a them.
Yes, absolutely right.
You can't. But as you say, that's a fine line, because if it's not porous and if it goes too far, it can be enormously exclusive.
Exactly so. But I think he was the master of doing it really, really well. Because he was part of something bigger. He understood that, but his contribution was to get the best out of that immediate team there, and that did mean a them as well. And he played that extremely well.
Well, you in one of the interviews that I read, you were asked about what you found most helpful, and you talked about coaching and the coaching that you receive. And, I often, obviously working with a lot of senior leaders, trying to convince them that coaching might be a good idea can often be a trial, but clearly you don't see it that way.
No, I don't. So my story, I've had the same, she calls herself executive coach for 19 years. And I would probably say there is nothing about me she doesn't know or hasn't worked out, and she could probably assess my psychology perfectly. But there's two things that need to be said about it. So I've personally found it very helpful. I've seen other people really thrive with a coach, but it's not a point of coach and all will be forgiven. You have to work really, really hard in a coaching relationship. So I was HR director of John Lewis before I was a CEO, and we used to set people up with their coaches, and you sort of would know this is going to be a successful relationship, it's really going to make a difference, and others weren't. And often it was about the coached person's willingness to really throw themselves in. And you know what? That means talking about your vulnerabilities, your weaknesses. I don't mind saying on here, one of the issues for me was my sexuality and how that worked in a business community. And she was incredibly helpful for me to talk that through. I had no problem with being honest about it, but but you always just have this thought in your mind about how people are assessing that. So you do have, and it's perhaps a good example of, to get the most out of a coaching relationship, you've got to be all in and you've got to accept your vulnerabilities.
Yeah, and it's so important, isn't it? And it also illustrates that point, that the idea that there isn't every part of ourselves that we bring into our workplaces and our leadership.
You leave lots of it behind.
You know,
it's all part
there
of
with you.
It's all part of you, and it's influencing the decisions that you're making.
Right. Right. And how do you said earlier that continuing to learn is important. How do you stay sort of inquisitive in that way? Because particularly I think in politics where, learning is sometimes characterized as a U-turn, let's say, that changing your mind somehow is kind of not allowed. So, but we know that actually, of course, we're going to learn, and staying inquisitive is so important. How do you manage that?
I actually don't know. That's the first question you've asked me. I thought I don't know the answer to. I think it's first thing, just to pick up on what you said, it's as a sign of huge strength to admit you don't know the answer, and to admit that you might have got something wrong and think again. And it's a very, very stupid person who believes that's not going to happen every now and again. I actually look back at one of my most formative learning experiences was when I got a commercial decision very badly wrong in John Lewis. And the boss then basically said to me, it's okay, Andy, to screw it up once as long as you learn from it. And mistakes are the best opportunity for learning. But that doesn't, I think it's a good point to draw out, but doesn't necessarily answer your question head on. I think it's about an attitude of mind, which is partly about a constant, inquisitiveness. The word I tend to use is restlessness. The biggest sin is a complacency, a satisfaction with what you've got. Again, it's a John Lewis story, but we used to talk a lot about this around our board table in John Lewis, and it says quite a lot about my psychology, this. I used to say to the team in the years where we were doing really well, we must be paranoid on the upswing. That was the phrase. I.e., however it looks that things are going your way, you should always be looking for the things that are going wrong. Be paranoid about them, because they will in time catch up with you. And so I hope I somewhat embody that restlessness that I was trying to get the team to think about.
I guess moving from business to politics is another way of I suppose a way of being a bit restless. Certainly taking
it was madness.
Certainly taking on new challenges. People often think these business people are going to make great politicians, and it doesn't always work out. I mean,
tends not to.
Yeah. What have you had to learn?
Well, the first thing that should be said is this is a very different political job to many. So, as I say, I've led John Lewis for nearly 10 years, and people kept saying to me, oh, yeah, surely you want to go and be an MP. No, I do not. And I don't actually believe the skills I'd learned as in a commercial organisation were going to be relevant to being an MP. But this job, which is about a leadership job across a large space where you are the front man and you got to do all the things we've been talking about, assemble a team, sell a strategy, listen to what's going on around you. And it's an executive job, this. I'm not whipped by the Conservative Party. I'm the boss as to what's going on here. And so this political job was more suitable. So I think the most important learning point to come out of that whole experience is thinking about which political job lent itself to using the skills that you'd learnt in business.
And one of the other characteristics of this job is there you are, the Metro Mayor, but as we know, it's combined authority,
yes.
And you have both Conservative and Labour
Absolutely.
authorities, always have done throughout your tenure. It's varied a bit, but always a mix.
Yeah, always.
What's the particular leadership that you have to offer in that context?
I think it's an important question. So let's just be clear. We have 7 local authorities in our constituent members. 3 are Conservative authorities, 4 are Labour authorities, Conservative mayors. You can all see the immediate situation. So, and this is so different to the conventional political model in London, where it is assumed that the Prime Minister has an overall majority in the House of Commons and has a team of MPs who are doing his bidding, and he will get his way come what may. We are not in that situation. So it's all about collaboration, mutual respect, and compromise. And one of the things that is often said around our board table by the very wise leaders of the councils and one of them I'm thinking of in particular is the leader of Walsall, he wouldn't mind me saying, has been around a long time. And occasionally he reminds us that the principle here is we don't all get everything we want at the same time. You don't win every argument, but you have to stand back and see the bigger picture and accept that over time we will all thrive together. And that is absolutely the right attitude to this. And it takes compromise, collaboration, that sense of overall outcome to actually make that work.
I don't want to stretch this point, but it strikes me that there is some kind of connection between that description and the sort of mutualism that's at the heart of John Lewis. I mean,
correct.
Do you see that?
Yes, it is. Often the question is, how come your transition from business to politics has been okay, when actually we've got quite a lot of examples in Britain where it hasn't been particularly good. And we certainly don't have lots of examples of people moving out of business into leading political roles. I personally wish there were many, many more. So part of the answer is the type of business that John Lewis was. It too is a democracy. I was accountable to the partners, not to the shareholders, to the partners. Its purpose is, quote unquote, the happiness of all of its members. So the way we did it was actually almost like a parliamentary democracy, actually. So I was aware that my business experience was quite different to if you'd been running a private equity-backed company or you'd been running a family-owned company. Totally different. I was there as the servant of the partners, and you always had to remember that, and they could ultimately get rid of you. Exactly the same as the political model here. I'm only there so long as the voters of the West Midlands tolerate it. So there is a huge similarity, and I genuinely think that's what's helped in my own story.
Fascinating. And Andy, final question, which we ask all of our guests on this podcast, which is, whose leadership inspires you?
I'm not going to give you a name of somebody, but I'm going to give you a theme that we've not talked about. It is those people who have kept loyally saying the climate change agenda, the net zero agenda, as we're now calling it, has actually got to be the primary issue. Because it would have been, and we can all think of some of the characters who've led that, it would have been very, very easy to step aside from that. But I really feel genuinely that is the defining issue. And I'm grateful to those who over the years have not faltered in that. And I actually feel that the UK has done a very good job internationally. COP26 up in Glasgow made me quite proud to be British, because we were saying to the rest of the world, this is a no compromise issue. And I certainly intend to continue to fight within government that issue is given the prominence it needs.
Andy, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been absolutely fascinating to explore the full breadth of your leadership experience. One thing that strikes me about the way that you've described your leadership is, on the one hand, these rather sort of old-fashioned words like discipline and trust and service that you combine with a real focus on some very contemporary ideas around inclusion, but also something which perhaps we need rather more of, around compromise. And it leaves me wondering whether, as we see this kind of leadership play out, maybe the West Midlands is going to have something to offer the rest of the country as we think about what kind of leadership we really need right now. So thank you for that. And to our listeners, thank you for listening as always. All the details discussed today will be in our show notes. If you've enjoyed this episode and you would like to support the podcast, do please subscribe or leave us a review and rating now. And you can find out more information about the Leadership Exchange podcast at birmingham.ac.uk/leadership-exchanged. Thank you.